CEF means Christian Education and Fellowship. And during that time, I'm with the adults. We have things for all ages. And Jen shared something I wanted her to share for the congregation. And before we bring her up, she's going to be talking about part of it is first fruits. And so I'm going to read a passage, and I'll let Jen take it from there. And you'll notice first fruits in this passage. It comes from 2 Chronicles. So this is Old Testament, 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verses 4 through 6. 2 Chronicles 31, 4 through 6. It reads, "And he ordered the people living in Jerusalem to give the portion due to the priests and Levites so they could devote themselves to the law of the Lord. As soon as the order went out, the Israelites generously gave," and that was the topic from last week. Our giving, it should be generous. The Israelites generously gave the first fruits of their grain, new wine, olive oil, and honey, and all that the fields produced. They brought a great amount, a tithe of everything. The people of Israel and Judah, who lived in the towns of Judah, also brought a tithe of their herds and flocks, and a tithe of the holy things dedicated to the Lord their God. And they piled them in heaps. Jen.
Walk all the way up here. Last week, during the service, we had time where we were in little groups talking about some questions about giving and money and what have you. And one of the things that our little group talked about, one of the questions was, how do you know if money has a hold on you? Basically, how do you know if money has a hold on a person? And one of the things that we talked about had to do with your giving, that when you're giving, what is your choice? Where is it in your thought process? Do you give first and then do the rest, or is your giving your afterthought? After everything else is taken care of, what's left we can give, or if we're saving for this right now, so we're only going to give this much right now, and then once we've got that, then we'll bump our giving back up, or is it just to start out right away with, yep, this much is going to God, then we'll pay our bills, and then if there's extra, we'll give more. But is that the first thing that you think of, or is it the last?
I heard her share that, and I thought, that's so good. We need to get her up, and she was willing. That was. Public speaking is not the easy thing. You know how much I struggle with it up here sometimes. So, some of you snicker, but I'm a nervous wreck on Sundays. I could barely eat anything last night. For those of you who were at game night with me, knew that was not true. How true that is! What Jen just said. We can be tempted that after everything else is paid for and taken care of that month, if there's anything left, then maybe God gets it. Versus what we read in the Old Testament there in Chronicles, and what Jen was saying, this idea of first fruits. And where does the idea of offering come into our planning, if at all? Right? Do we plan to give to God, or is it simply an afterthought? And Jen shared that. That's still a challenge to me, and thank you, Jen. And the idea is the intentionality that God asks of us to make this the first fruits. The first thing of our month is to say, I want to be a generous, sacrificial, and joyful giver, and God's going to get the first instead of the last, if there is any leftovers at the end of the month. And so it's a challenge for me, and I pray for you if that's a challenge for you. You're certainly in my prayers as well. But we are in the second week of a sermon series called This Too is an Act of Worship. And if you've been with us for a while, you know when I say this phrase, this too is an act of worship, I say that when we do our offering. I say we're going to do our offering. I want just to remind everybody, and it's a reminder to me as well, to say, now this offering, this too is an act of worship. And my prayer oftentimes includes three things. Lord, help us to be generous givers, which the word last week for that sermon was generosity. Help us to be generous givers. Today, it's the second word, help us to be sacrificial givers. And so sacrifice is the sermon word for today. And then next week is going to be joyfully. So help us to be generous givers, sacrificial givers, and joyful givers. And so this is week number 2. We focus on the second word in that prayer, sacrificial givers. Months ago, as I was thinking through God, what do you want to be carving in us at Whiting in terms of our offering? I think he was saying, let them understand that this isn't about the budget. This is about worship. And talk about these three things. And I thought about the second word, help us to be sacrificial givers. And I thought, what a difficult word. Sacrifice. What a difficult word that is. And I was wrestling if that's really the word that I want to bring before us every Sunday when we do the offering. Sacrificial givers. To me, it's a very slippery word. Because I always ask myself in my mind, well, how will I ever know if my giving is truly sacrificial? Or if I'm just kind of letting myself off the hook easy, so to speak. That's something that I continue to ask myself this Sunday. The passage is in Romans chapter 12. I invite you to turn there with me. I'll be reading from the Gold Bible in your pews, Good News Bible, today's English version, Romans chapter 12. I'll give us a minute to turn there. It's page 215 of the New Testament, page 215. And it's going to focus on this idea of sacrifice. Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 1. Page 215 in your pew Bible. And it says this, so then, my brothers, because of God's great mercy to us, I appeal to you. So this is the appeal. Offer yourselves as a living sacrifice to God. So there's that word sacrifice. Here's the appeal. Offer yourselves as a living sacrifice to God, dedicate it to his service, and pleasing to him. This is the true worship that you should offer. Goes on in verse 2. Do not conform yourselves to the standards of this world, but let God transform you inwardly by a complete change of your mind. Then you will be able to know the will of God, what is good, what is good and is pleasing to him and is perfect. I think about how verse 2 is so applicable to us today when it talks about do not conform yourselves to the standards of this world. Last week in generosity, I was saying, don't look to the left or to the right and try to compare your generosity with others or try to take your cues from others about generosity. If you want to see generosity, the clearest picture of generosity, look to Christ on the cross. Because God so loved the world, he gave. John chapter 3, verse 16. That's the picture of generosity. God so loved the world, he gave. Giving and generosity. We look to Christ for that cue. And so we don't look to the left or to the right. And in here today, I'm going to encourage you again, as you look at this word sacrifice, don't look at the standards of this world. Verse 2. Don't conform to the standards of this world to try to take your cues on what Christian sacrifice ought to look like. Again, look to Christ on the cross for what sacrifice looks like. And we can give a world a different picture of what generosity looks like and what sacrifice looks like. And next Sunday, the third word, what joyful giving would look like. So I encourage you to spend some time this week in prayer with God and say, am I being conformed to the standards of this world with a watered-down notion of sacrifice? And so every week, I'm talking about offering to God and actual, checks and bills in the offering plate. I'm talking about that, but I'm also talking about it in a larger umbrella framework. Because if we have guests and visitors here who aren't connected, who you're saying, this is not my church home, then figure out where that would be. Who's helping feed you spiritually? And be that generous, that sacrificial and joyful giver in your own home church context. But if you say this is your church home, or if you don't have a church home yet, but you're thinking about setting down your roots here, then I would say that if we're the ones who help feed you, give joyfully, sacrificially, and generously. Why? Because that's the same thing that we do with our physical food. And so that's what we should do with our spiritual food. So yesterday morning, Jeff and I went to Papa's Diner? That's the name of it, on Self-Commercial there. And we ate food at Papa's Diner. We ate physical food. And then at the end, do you know who got our money? Papa's Diner. I didn't go across the street or down the road and go to McDonald's and then pay McDonald's for the food I ate at Papa's Diner. It makes sense when we talk about physical food, right? So if you get your spiritual nourishment at Whiting Community Baptist Church, guess what? It makes sense that your giving ought to go to Whiting Community Baptist Church. Help pay and support the people who are feeding you. Okay? Pull out my stool. Sometimes I get too animated. So, and especially I think on this really important sermon series where we are focusing on money, I think it's really important for me to sit with you, to meet with you where you're at, and try to have some sort of emotional connection. Because I know at the end of the day, as logical and as biblical and as reasonable I can make this sermon series, if there's an emotional disconnect with you guys, you're not going to become those kind of generous, sacrificial, and joyful givers. And I was always astounded when I was in college, I had this philosophy professor that always said, don't try to give an intellectual response to an emotional question. And this topic of money is probably pretty emotionally charged for a lot of us. I can imagine when you walked in here today or walked in last week and knew I was going to be talking about money, probably some of us, something happened emotionally within us right away. And so I want to be sensitive. And I ask that you would be sensitive to what's happening emotionally and try to meet me halfway and help to break down some of those barriers. Right? You can put those barriers up after I'm done with the sermon series, right? But just give me a few weeks here, people. Give me a few weeks, okay? I want to talk about sacrifice now. As Romans 12:1 has just, he appeals to us, offer yourselves as living sacrifices. I heard, is it bow hunting season started? Is this right? George, is this right? George says yes, right? And this picture, like Old Testament was very bloody, and they would have these sacrifices on these altars, right? And these animals would be killed. And say George went deer hunting and he put a dead deer up here. Is that dead deer going to move on its own, George? No. Not unless someone comes and physically moves it, right? The deer is dead. Old Testament sacrifices, they're dead. They don't move. And so they don't run away from the altar because they are dead. The problem for us in the New Testament, people, is this. Paul has just asked us in Romans 12, offer yourselves as living sacrifices. So we go on the altar of God, but guess what? We keep squirming around. We keep moving. He wants us to offer our entire lives to him. And guess what? I can be there offering myself to God, but then I wiggle away, right? I run away. Because I don't really, at some level, as much as I trust God, I don't trust him fully or all the time, or certainly when there's idols in my life I want to hold on to. I don't want to put that on the altar for God. I want to keep that. And so the problem with living sacrifices is the living thing keeps running away. And so God keeps calling us back. A living sacrifice being offered on the altar of God every day. Wow. What discipline, right? To not run away. To our idols? Or out of fear, out of mistrust? I stood up from my stool. Do you see how that happens? I know pastors get in trouble when they move from generalness, vagueness, loftiness, hypotheticalness, when they move from general to specific. If I talk always in generalities in this church, I can't win over everybody, but I would probably do a pretty good deal if I continue to talk in generalities. The things that get pastors in problems, in trouble, is when they move from general things, which people never really take on as their own because he's just talking generally distant out there. But when I make it specific, when I try to personalize things, it hits perhaps too close at home. And so I'm going to try to get specific, I'm going to try to get personal if you'll meet me halfway here, and realizing that it's going to make us uncomfortable at times. But knowing that because I love you, I just can't talk about this topic at arm's length in a general sort of way. We have to allow it to come close to our hearts. Let it hit home. Speak to our affections and our idols. So I'm going to throw some things out here talking about sacrifice in specific. And I'm going to preface it with this. I don't know if God wants you to sacrifice or give up anything that I'm about to read. I don't know if he wants you to sacrifice and give this up one way or the other. Here are some of the things I'm talking about. For us to be able to be generous, sacrificial, and joyful, we have to give up something. Sacrifice entails giving up something. And so what are you going to give up so that you can increase your giving? What are you going to give up to increase your giving? Is it going to be a cheaper cell phone plan, right? Going from 3 gigs of data to 2 gigs of data, or 1 gig of data, or if you don't know what gigs of data are, okay, then that's not for you. That's okay. Next one. Just limit tech spending in general. Slower speed of internet, or go without internet. And so for some of you, that's just unthinkable to go without internet at home. Okay, I'm just pressing in with some different questions, okay? Because if the word sacrifice means sacrifice, I don't want to have a weak, a soft, or a watered-down definition. I want sacrifice to be true sacrifice, so that we truly sacrifice and give up something so that we can give more to God. And so the list is going to get rougher, right? Here we go. Maybe in order to give more to God, he's asking us to sacrifice cable TV or dish TV or satellite. There's all these different things out there. I don't know. I can't keep them all straight, right? Or Hulu or Netflix. Maybe he's calling you to sacrifice that. What is Netflix $9 a month these days or something, right? And so if you're saying, I'm going to give up Netflix $9 a month, that means you give up the Netflix $9 a month, and it doesn't mean you take the $9 and go somewhere else with it, right? If you're giving something up for God, you don't go and use it elsewhere. You give it to God. Maybe God is asking you to give up the vacation, or to vacation closer to home. Or when you go on vacation, you stay at the Super 8 or the Motel 6. That's well within the bounds of God to ask. And so you need to have that conversation with God. Maybe it's not going out to eat. Figure out how many times you go out to eat in a week, and you say, I don't want to go out to eat at all, or I'm not going to go out to eat as much. I'm going to give that to God instead. Or give up a boat, or a camper, or a campground, or an RV, or a motorcycle, or a snowmobile. I put those, they call those big ticket items, is that what they call them, right? I put those things on this list because whether we come to Christ or we're in a relationship already with Christ, it's all on the table. If God is God, God has the right to say, hey, Nick, no more motorcycle. I don't have a motorcycle, but he has the right to say that. Or no more RV. And that's not wrong of God to ask that of you. And guess what? Compared to what the people in the Bible gave up, anything that I just mentioned, boat, camper, RV, motorcycle, snowmobile, anything I just mentioned there, guess what? Oftentimes that pales in comparison to the sacrifice that the people in the Bible gave up. And yes, God asks people to give up those sorts of items. Is he asking you to give that up? Don't look at me, I don't know. I make a crummy husband sometimes. I make an even worse God. So I don't know. But you have to be open and have that conversation with God. Everything's on the table. The living sacrifice on the altar. I ask this of you. Before you buy things, pray. Go to the store, pray. Before you go out to eat, pray. Before you go on that vacation or click the airfare, pray. And say, one of the ways in which it helps me is to say, by me getting A, B, C, X, Y, Z, whatever it is across the board, by me getting this, is it going to entice me to be less generous or less sacrificial in my offering next week? If what I'm getting is going to entice me to be less generous and less sacrificial, guess what? That's a pretty good litmus test for me to know that's probably I shouldn't get it. None of these things I'm mentioning on this list, by the way, are sin. None of them are sin. But you have to ask yourself the questions because none of them necessarily are sin, but they all can be sin. One sin for you, another sin for another person. What's sin for one person might not be sin for another. Everything's fair game with God. Not just pray before you buy anything, but pray daily to help ask God, say, God, help me discern my needs from my wants. Help me discern my needs from my wants. Because there's no chance for us to be sacrificial givers if we're giving into all these accessories all the time. And again, wants aren't necessarily sinful. There's a lot of things that I have in my life that are simply, they're not needs. They are pure wants. And that's not necessarily sinful, but they could be sinful. And so it's always, God, I'm there as a living sacrifice. Speak to me in a personalized, individual way so I can navigate through these difficult waters of what it means to be a generous, sacrificial, and joyful giver. Okay. Does this make some sense? As Christians, we ask God, what should I keep as a Christian? And what should I buy as a Christian? And all the while asking these questions, being mindful and careful that we're not simply tempted to insert our own whims and wishes for God's voice and will for our lives. Simply, I miss a close relationship with God in my life. And you might find this too. You might miss a close relationship with God in your life because you're simply not honestly listening to God. I've been guilty of really being dishonest before God in terms of my generosity and being sacrificial. Been dishonest. And so be honest with God this week about, am I sacrificing? Do I just have a weak definition or a soft definition or a watered down definition? And is there really a lifestyle change that I'm undergoing because God calls us to sacrifice? I conclude with this. And it gets really at the foundational level. I can imagine that some of us simply have a problem with the word sacrifice. We're just backing up, right? At the foundational level, some of us probably have a problem with the word sacrifice. Christianity is a story of Christ on the cross, that generous and sacrificial love. He paid it all for us on that cross. And some of us want to think this. Use the word sacrifice only in this way, Pastor. Christianity is a story about God's sacrifice. You might say, and stop there. And I say, no, I have to keep on going. Because Christianity is, yes, it's a story about God's sacrifice, but it goes on from there and says this. Christianity is also a story about our sacrifice. When Jesus calls a person, he bids them to come and die. It's a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer I did a couple of months ago. When Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die, to come and sacrifice. I think it was actually Nancy. It was a couple months ago I said this quote, and Nancy said, that really resonated. I never really quite heard it put that way, Pastor Nick, but it totally makes sense. That the cross isn't just for Jesus. The cross and sacrifice is for us too. He bids us to come and join in this kind of sacrificial love and generosity. Does God call us to sacrifice? A person who is unconvinced says this. No, a good God would not ask me to sacrifice anything. God would not ask me to do anything I don't want to do. Because there they just think they can't fathom that a loving, good God would call for sacrifice. If you listen to the sermon today, a strong, meaningful notion of sacrifice. Where you're actually, guess what? Sacrificing people. The next person says this, however. A person has to wonder, If God cannot call us to sacrifice, if that's outside of the realm of possibility, if that's outside of the bounds of God, he can't call me to sacrifice, then the question is this, then who gets to call the shots? God or us? Who's really the functional God in our lives? No longer God, but it's the human. You see, God can ask things of us, and in fact, God can ask costly things of us. And that is right for God to do. And he does that all throughout the Bible, and he asks that for us today, 21st century, 2015, a Whiting Community Baptist Church. It's the same God with the same sacrificial calling. For all the disciples. That is God's right to do. We are not God, and we cannot strip God of his voice, or of his commands, or of his authority over our lives. Yes, a good God can not only ask, and I can put it stronger than that. God can, in fact, command me to sacrifice. And God remains good and right in doing so. Let us pray for our offering. Father, Christianity has two kinds of sacrifice. First, because of your love for us, you respond to us in sacrifice. Jesus on the cross, the ultimate sacrifice. And then secondly, you ask us to respond as living sacrifices, as it's said in Romans chapter 12. Father, sacrifice is such a difficult word. Help me and help everybody in this place. That what we give to people who help feed us spiritually, that we would help give that offering sacrificially. And it would be costly if it's sacrificial, of course. And it means giving up real things that we want to hold on to, but that's part of sacrifice, of course. And so, Lord, help us to deal with these things truthfully and honestly, openly and vulnerably with you this week. It's ultimately for your glory and for spreading your gospel to the ends of the earth that we seek to have this offering go towards. In Jesus' name, amen. Wonderful. And that's page 458. And the song is called again, Holly? Take my life and let it be consecrated. Wonderful. Can you give them a moment so we can turn there too? We can read along? Okay. Thank you, Holly. Ushers.
And with that, would you stand